Chapter 5, Leave of Absence. Shortly after the disappointing debrief with our church's global outreach leadership team, Chad and I had to decide what to do with his job. He had taken a 1-year leave of absence, and while we were still on the field, he had submitted an email requesting a second year. Now that we were suddenly back in the States, his administrator reached out to Chad offering his job back for the upcoming school year. The admin needed to know within the next 24 hours. We had to make a very fast, heart-wrenching decision to take the job again, since the current status of the world was in lockdown and turmoil for the unforeseeable future. We informed Jerry, and he promptly drew up a leave of absence form. Again, this agency side branch was forming their processes on the fly as we were their guinea pig family. Jerry then held a virtual meeting with us and the agency executive directors to explain our decision and his form. The top had reasons why we were taking a leave of absence: to work on our marriage, our communication, and to resolve conflict. He pointed the finger at us too. The bottom had a long list of expectations, and they were all things we had to do. No one else had any responsibilities or expectations to meet during our leave, and that was it. They left us alone, all of them. They left me in trauma, in heartbreak, in shell shock, in a shipwreck of a field experience, in shame, and they left me voiceless. They didn't provide post-traumatic care, didn't provide any special reading material or recommended missionary retreats for our family. They didn't hold any post-evacuation team meetings to discuss what happened, and we were the ones to blame. One day in early June, I remember laying down to finally relax on one of the upstairs beds for a short time while Chad took the kids on a bike ride around the neighborhood. There had been few times I was apart from the kids in the last 6 months. I remember feeling like someone had laid me out on an electrocution table and given me the highest voltage possible. I felt like I was in complete shock. I could barely move, barely breathe. I felt like a complete zombie. I took a few concentrated deep breaths and let them out slowly, focusing on relaxing. Suddenly, the doorbell began to ring profusely. I ran downstairs to find our oldest daughter being carried in the door by Chad, and she was hurt badly. Her mouth was bloody and she looked in shock. She had tried to get her bike onto the sidewalk from the road via a driveway, but it was more like a low curb. The bike tire got stuck on the lip and slipped beneath her while she went down, hands and face first, breaking both wrists and her 2 front teeth. Chad took her to the ER and from there straight to the dentist for an emergency root canal. All of a sudden, we had a girl in wrist braces who couldn't even feed herself. Eventually, one wrist brace turned into a cast. Fortunately, it wasn't long before she was able to function on her own. Nevertheless, this occurrence was an added layer of stress and trauma to our already haphazard circumstances. As we continued to attempt to follow orders on our leave of absence list of expectations, I signed up for counseling sessions from a licensed Christian counselor at a local center. Chad and I continued meetings with the Jacksons and began bi-weekly dinner meetings with Stan, the executive pastor at our home church, and his wife, Jamie, for continued check-ins and counseling at Jerry's direction. I was distressed. I was having heart palpitations, insomnia, difficulty staying calm, difficulty breathing, and outbursts of rage. Loud noises were disruptive and startled me easily. I wasn't showering regularly or brushing my teeth. I'd often leave to go on 1 to 2 hour long drives by myself, many times wishing I could drive into the river and end it all. I was suffering. I was angry and disillusioned by everyone and even by God. While on the field, I felt even God himself had abandoned me. I could feel it happening. My thoughts and emotions in my brain would seep down into my face. Facial muscles would tighten and my jaws would clench. When my face would harden, it would then creep down and grab hold of my heart. Where I once had a soft, loving, and joyful heart, it was hardening and turning cold as stone. It's like someone turned the lights out. Even though we had bright summer sunshine, the world around me went dark. Colors became dull and less vivid. I lost my trust in people. Suddenly, the world seemed to be filled with evil people who performed wickedly. I could trust no one. I wasn't even sure I could trust God. I've never been so alone in my life, hating myself and hating others. I would go on walks to sit on a bench and breathe, staring out at the river, wide and blue, steady and consistent. I tried to take comfort in the sight, but inside was a war zone. Or was I a frozen, empty shell? My ability to be a wife and mother suffered greatly. I couldn't cook, couldn't clean the house. Chad bore the load of chores and parenting over half the time as I struggled to get out of bed. I stopped reading my Bible. I had no desire to read any books at all. I couldn't pray. The only prayer I could pray was, "Help me," in a whisper just barely escaping my lips as I lay on my bed. I've never experienced that level of physical, emotional, spiritual, mental, or relational exhaustion before. Another month went by, and I reached out to Janet again. I was ready to talk and needed help processing. Jerry and Janet drove up again for another meeting with us. They sat in our backyard and Jerry told us, "Jesus Christ loves you." I brought up the missing team meetings issue again, and he simply stated, "Patrick said you had team meetings." End of discussion. Janet hinted at the notion that I needed to die to self. In regard to our difficulty with Heidi, I was told, "Heidi wasn't going to be your friend. I know you had that hope. You'll have to change your expectations." Then they drove home. I tried to let that meeting encourage me, but it really didn't. I knew something was wrong, and I felt it. This was the second meeting to go awry, or was it the fourth? I emailed the 2 executive directors at the agency home office expressing my desire to debrief with them and that I felt we had lost that relationship with them when Jerry and Janet became our direct bosses. They tried to understand and held a meeting with one in attendance, but I don't think they understood. At the time, I knew something felt wrong, but I didn't fully understand in a way I could explain either. I felt Jerry was still our church's global outreach director because that's how he started. Somehow, things rapidly changed while we were away. We couldn't wrap our minds around not having someone at our church. Now, he was our main point of contact in our agency, taking over the former communications we had with the 2 new executive directors. Our sending church didn't fill his vacated position, and we didn't know who to talk to. To be honest, the global outreach team, including Stan, still looked to Jerry for direction regarding our situation. Where we once had 3 separate legs of support, Patrick and Heidi on the field team, Alex and Micah, agency executive directors, and Jerry and Janet, home sending church global outreach director. This shifting of roles left us standing on only one support leg, Jerry and Janet. and everyone else was now looking to them for direction. We also reconnected with a couple in our hometown who were part of a different field team in this small agency branch. The Spencers were incredibly friendly and even had our family over for dinner one evening. They were trying to recruit us into their field team within this agency in a different part of Asia. I met with the wife, Kathy, on more regular occasions to share my distress, grief, and pain over what had happened and keeping her up to date on the communications. Over time, she and her husband became well aware of what was going on. In September, Patrick and Heidi reached out to Chad and me asking for help designing their church's stage area, since they had flipped the room around to the other end. They had also located another space for rent a few doors down from their church, so they had a new office building for the staff. I drew a few pictures of what the stage could look like with recommended colors and materials and a potential furniture placement plan for their office's main space and sent them to Heidi. Chad discussed sound system and technology with Patrick. Chad and I were happy they found a new building and wished we were still there to help with setup, although we were happy to contribute to this project from a distance. After all, that's what we were working on with them while on the field. Another school year started and I homeschooled the older two kids while the youngest attended a nearby preschool. Since we were in the States for the next school year, we had purchased the rental before they sold it out from under us, and we had to move yet again. We started remodeling. When it was completed after 3 months, we moved our dishes into the kitchen the first week of October. We were finally settled after our evacuation from Asia. We'd been moving around, living in 4 different houses for 6 months. We randomly had a short phone call one day that fall with Patrick and Heidi. Patrick started with a very brief, "I'm sorry we left for a week in January." That was it. They wanted to know if we were returning. Chad was excited, but I shared that God would have to reconfirm for me our return to this field team. Why would I return to this team if the only communication we received from them in the 6 months following evacuation was if we could help them with their stage and one phone conversation with a half apology to see if we were coming back? The truth is, Chad and I would often discuss and dream of a return to the mission field. The only holdup for me was the agency. I needed to feel like I was part of a team and what I had to say mattered. I needed to know I wasn't just someone else's pawn. By mid-October, I was willing to try one more meeting with Jerry and Janet. After all, our apartment on the field was still intact, and we were still paying for it from our agency account. It had been useful for the ministry there, so that was a bonus. Patrick and Heidi's family had lived in it for several months, including the time they had their new baby. Another family lived in our flat for a month as they were completing their adoption process. In addition, a single man was soon arriving on the field to join the agency team, with plans of living in our flat for a month or 2 until he secured his own. For this final meeting, determinedly, I was prepared with a specific list to discuss with Jerry and Janet as recommended by my counselor. We began driving to their new hometown, and 4 hours later, we first met at a local coffee shop with the Jacksons of Member Care, who also happened to be in town. We sat down with our coffee drinks in a small room. The Jacksons asked what we hoped to get out of the upcoming meeting with Jerry and Janet. I said, we hoped to feel validated. They agreed that was a wonderful goal, then counseled us to be prepared if we didn't get the result we were wanting. Then we all went to Jerry and Janet's new home for lunch. After a short tour of their new home and a delicious lunch, the Jacksons took off for their hometown. I desperately wanted to ask them to stay and listen. I wanted them to mediate and help guide the conversation if I didn't feel heard yet again. The meeting started off with a bang. I had my list of 6 things to address and was immediately put on the spot to share first. Following a wonderful, hospitable lunch, I wasn't particularly up to the task of confrontation. Doing it myself alone was also daunting. Chad didn't really understand me. Uneasily, I started with, "We'd like to feel validated." I quickly listed all 6 items from my list. I got one nod of response from Janet after stating we were hurt by the way they handled the debrief meeting with our Sending Churches Global Outreach leadership team. After I finished, she responded, "So, tell me why you felt it was so difficult to communicate between the 2 of you." I answered her question. I didn't realize until later that the items on the list regarding the conflict we had with them had been completely avoided. Chad knew it in the moment, but didn't help steer the conversation back to discussion on my points either. Then it was their turn to talk. Jerry advised us not to become bitter because the enemy would want us to stay in that place. He stated, "The field is what it is, and you'll have to decide if you want to be part of it." He offered us a position of general service back on that field, but not specifically a music school project. I then shared my thoughts about needing a weekly meeting with a member care woman while on the field, and Janet immediately responded, "Oh, it would never be enough." I shared my thoughts on being on the field 9 or 10 months of the year and 2 to 3 months stateside, and her response was, "You know, missionaries used to ship themselves over in coffins because they never expected to return." I felt my ideas instantly overridden as she shared her expertise. I literally had nothing to contribute to the forming and shaping of this team. Janet then proceeded to tell a story about how she was really mad at another national partner for not following through on their expected task on the calendar. She explained how she had chosen to forgive that person without confrontation. She didn't explain why she told us that story or how that directly applied to our situation, and we weren't smart enough to ask any clarifying questions as to what she meant. It was very passive-aggressive. Chad and I both interpreted the meaning of her illustration to be this: we must forgive the national partners without confronting them. We left that meeting and Chad felt good. I couldn't sleep that night. Insomnia struck yet again. I tried to explain to Chad when he woke up how they completely avoided the confrontation. He too had noticed during the meeting, but thought it got resolved when I appeared satisfied. We realized later it takes me longer to process. I thought maybe we could attempt conflict resolution with them one more time the next day before we were to drive home. We asked to meet once more. Again, Chad didn't really understand my need. In between this request to meet and our original intention to try to resolve conflict yet again, I began to question myself. Was I in the wrong? Was I being prideful, demanding, bitter? Was I being rebellious against the spiritual authorities in my life? Since I felt all alone in what I was trying to accomplish, I ultimately decided to take Janet's advice from her story and do the super spiritual thing to try to forgive the national partners without needing to resolve conflict. When we met one more time, we enjoyed tea and cookies, had a friendly talk, and avoided any tender issues. We drove home that afternoon, and I was completely done. I just couldn't swallow or absorb what had happened on the field or during our leave because it was absolutely enormous. The wounds and battle scars were bleeding, gaping holes. Chad was actually thinking our meetings went well and we were on the road to return with the team. Each encounter with these people was leaving me with additional angst. I felt like they were conditioning us to comply. I felt like I was being asked to erase my identity and autonomy in order to stay on this team. They had shared their stance and presented the ultimatum: stay silent and raise no issue. Just do as you're told to serve this ministry. We had tried multiple times with them, but it wasn't going to be any other way but theirs. I wish I could explain and convince them otherwise, but they had their beliefs about how things should be, and I had mine. They weren't willing to listen or work with us. Therefore, we became incompatible. I felt disoriented. I questioned my sanity. Finally, I concluded that compliance would require me to betray my very sense of being, and I couldn't do it. They needed someone more agreeable than me, apparently. I didn't think trust could break down any further, but I was yet to be surprised. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. Matthew 18:15.